sheepish about even being up here with these two folks. When I introduced Ron at the chapel, I said, you know, being a part of a university it's just an extraordinarily rich life, because paraded before you every week, if not every day, are just extraordinary experiences, richly varied. But every once in a while, you know, there's one that it really rises to a whole new level. And so to have with us today two novelists as accomplished as these two, it's extraordinary. So I am going to try to be almost non-existent here and just ask good, expansive questions, and then keep my peace. So thank you for being here, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Bo, I wonder, you know, Dr. Corey just talked about your two novels. Could you take a little bit of time and describe them for us, what you're trying to accomplish, maybe what prompted you to write them?
Sure. I'll first make a distinction that's really important to me. Those are my first two published novels. There's a lot of stuff up in the cupboard upstairs in the hallway. That's important to me. You may not care, but that's you know, 450 pages or something that never saw the light of day. But I'm someone who strongly believes that no writing is wasted. And so I really believe that maybe I had to write those, you know, maybe they're failures or, you know, unfinished. Maybe I had to write those to get to the work that came after. So my first published novel is called The Distant Land of My Father. It's based on family history. It's based on the life of an uncle of mine who grew up in China. My grandparents were missionaries. He grew up there and then returned there as a young man and became a millionaire in Shanghai in the 30s, was seduced by the city, turned his back on his wife and child, and came to regret it, was imprisoned a couple of times, and in his later life, both my uncle and the character that I based on him worked very hard to make amends for the harm he had done. And he had lost all of his money, and he worked to regain some kind of relationship with he had a son. In the novel, it's a daughter. And what prompted me was I knew my uncle late in life, and I saw him kind of going through those changes, even though I didn't understand at the time what was happening. But it's really important to me. I wanted to tell his story because it's about the idea that it is never too late. And that it's a story with amends and forgiveness, and I really wanted to tell that, and that's what moves me about a story, is that kind of thing. I'm not somebody I don't like movies where they start here and they go down, 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 and then at the end things are worse than they ever were at the beginning. I get it. I want some kind of redemption at the end of it, and so this story called to me, and I wanted to tell his story, and that there was good even though there was a lot of pain. So it worked, and it was my first try at historical fiction, and I tried something set in London after the war, and that didn't work. And I went back to a story. My second published novel is called City of Tranquil Light. It's based on my maternal grandparents who were missionaries in China. This is a novel I didn't want to write. I resisted it. It was something my mom suggested. And I said, sure, Mom, kind of the way my daughter says it to me. What goes around comes around. But eventually, one day, I saw my grandparents' story in a different light. And again, I saw redemption, and I saw that there are a lot of bad missionaries out there, people who exploit the people they're supposed to serve. And I knew about those stories from doing research about Shanghai. But I began to read stories about people who gave their lives to those people in faraway lands. And I read about the price the cost of that kind of sacrifice. And that was another story I wanted to tell. It was one of joy and suffering and fulfillment and loss and all of those things that make up a wonderful life. And so those were the two novels.
Okay, thank you. Ron, you've written novels with, you know, widely variegated, not just theme, but setting. So the Old West, but also Hitler's Niece. I remember when that one came out, my friend Daniel DeRelay and I, we taught at the same university in Chicago. We both wondered what had gone on with you. They picked that title and that topic. But Hitler's Niece, now Exiles, and so maybe pick two or three and talk to us about what prompted you to write those books and maybe what you're hoping to accomplish.
Yeah. I remember when I was a senior in college, went to a bookstore with my best friend, and I said, someday I'm only going to be reading history. And he said, why? And I don't know why I said that, because I wasn't reading a lot of history then and at the time. So it kind of startled me, so I didn't actually have an answer to his why. But then I discovered that I just have a yearning to write about real people and what really happened. I'm trying to correct the imbalance that most Americans don't know history anymore. And I thought that these were really powerful stories and in some ways metaphorical stories that could give us a sense of ourselves by talking about very particular people, which of course was what Shakespeare was doing with his stuff. I likened myself to Shakespeare a lot. But Exiles was born out of my interest in Gerard Manley Hopkins. I had kind of a funny story. The president of Santa Clara University said, come up for dinner with me, I got an offer you can't refuse. And so he laid out the plan to hire me at Santa Clara University. I just made full professor at the University of California at Santa Cruz. And so I was worried about leaving that. And then I knew that typically the teaching load was 6 courses at Santa Clara, and I was only teaching 4 at UC Santa Cruz. And so I said I'd think about it. Then I decided to pray to Gerard Manley Hopkins because I knew he knew about writing, about the laborers involved in teaching, and I still couldn't make up my mind. Nothing seemed to be coming from Gerard. And then I got a phone call from the president, and he says, Ron, have you decided to take the job yet? And I said, no. He says, well, I've decided to call it the Gerard Manley Hopkins Chair. Does that mean anything to you? And it's like Paul being struck down, you know. I went to Damascus. But then I found it was a much better job than I thought it was going to be. So I got everything I wanted. And I felt indebted to Gerard for this. And so I got around to writing a novel about his life and about the lives of the nuns who were on the Deutschland that sunk on the way to Missouri, actually. But they sunk outside of England. And I thought of them as failures. They thought of themselves as failures in drowning. And I thought of Hopkins as a failure because none of his poems were published in his lifetime. He died in 1889. Finally, his friend Robert Bridges put together a collection in 1918. And then it started selling like crazy. And Poetry Magazine in 1920 said, this is some of the best poetry we've ever seen. We've never heard of this guy. And I thought and Hopkins at one point had written after a retreat that during the retreat he prayed to God to take care of his poetry, to see if it gets published or not. He's putting it all in his hands. And so he died thinking that God hadn't done anything with that. But his absolute trust in God made it possible for the stories or the poems to come out, and he's risen in esteem. There's been at least 90 books written about Gerard Manley Hopkins now. And that's astonishing when you think of how little known he was when he died. And my novel, Mariette in Ecstasy, was based somewhat on the life of Thérèse of Lisieux and another woman named Gemma Galgani. Thérèse of Lisieux died at a very young age, but she was famous for the little way, that she doesn't try to do grand things, she just tries to be somebody like a child of God. And she actually likened to her relationship to God as when she was a little baby at the bottom of the stairs. She saw her father at the top of the stairs and wanted to climb to him. He has opened up his arms, and then she couldn't climb any farther, and so he came down and picked her up and took her up the stairs with him. And she always thought of God as that way, that he stands at the top of the stairs, but if we need him, he comes down and picks us up. So I thought of that, again, it was about failure because Mariette is in this convent and then gets kicked out because she's so disruptive. The community is divided about her. Is she the real thing or is she a fraud? And I thought that was an interesting idea. And the last line actually came to me in a Christology class. The professor was talking about doing spiritual direction for a young woman. And she was trying to decide whether to go off and get married or enter a Carmelite convent. And she'd been praying about it for 2 months. And she said, I just can't come up with any decision about what God wants me to do. And he said, so I told her, maybe God is saying, surprise me. And so I ended up using that as the last line of the book. When it came to me, I thought, oh, that's exactly what I need. But it's the idea that we're held in kind of imbalance all the time. We're never quite sure which way to go. And sometimes God is not completely directive. He's saying, surprise me. And we have to have confidence in ourselves and trust in God simultaneously. So those are the origins of those books. Is that enough? Do you want me to say more? I could go on.
Okay, I have one more.
Okay. You know, the movie, The Assassination of Jesse James, was based on a novel by me, and I began it just because I was asked to write about the Old West, just a short story about the Old West. For Tri-Quarterly magazine, I wrote about 30 pages and discovered I had a novel and I didn't have a short story. But it's a simple story. Bob Ford is a fan of Jesse James, and he ends up realizing that his life is in jeopardy, so he shoots Jesse James, thinking, and for a while he's treated like a hero, then he's treated like Judas. And the more I worked on it, the more I looked at Jesse James as both a Jesus figure and an Antichrist, and how the American public couldn't decide which he was, whether he was a hero or a villain. And lately, it seems like a lot of people are naming their kids Jesse. So I'm thinking that they're thinking of him as a hero, but I didn't think of him that way. I thought he was a sociopath. But I was most interested in Bob Ford, and a lot of people had always, written Robert Ford off. And I thought he had the complex Christian life of trying to do the right thing, ending up doing the wrong thing, and not knowing how to get out of that. So what at first seemed a real gain in his self-esteem by being lauded as this hero who killed this villain, turns on him after a couple of years. And he realizes he's a pariah. And I think a lot of people have to go through that, where they think that they did the right thing and then they have to suffer the consequences, and they feel shackled by it. And the last line of the novel is after Bob Ford gets shot himself. And I said the light going out of his eyes before he could say the right words. And I thought the right words were forgive me, or something on the order of what we would say if we were more God-directed. And Bob he was a preacher's son, but didn't seem to be religious at all. But I thought of that as that he was misunderstood, but also he didn't know how to convey an understanding of himself.
So maybe the same question to both of you. What's the role of a novelist, and in particular a Christian novelist, in our day?
Role of a novelist. Well, my writing life, I feel uncomfortable saying the role of a novelist, as in other novelists should do this, but I can certainly tell you how I view it. My novel, City of Tranquil Light, the second novel, was a turning point in my writing life. Kind of a late one, you might say, because a lot of stuff preceded it. But I started writing that novel and about my grandparents, based on my grandparents, and when I was about 80 pages into it, it wasn't good, and I knew that, but I've accepted that my first drafts are often, or maybe always, not good. And I've made peace with that, and I work anyway. But I had these 80 pages, and they weren't very good, but I thought the only way out is through, so I'll keep going. And in September of 2004, I was diagnosed with stage 1 breast cancer. And I'm healthy, I'm almost 10 years out, and very grateful, and I feel great. And it was a strange kind of illness where they said, we've caught it really early, great news, now we're gonna give it everything we got. So we caught it early and we're gonna treat it very aggressively. So I had 6 rounds of chemo and 30 radiation treatments, 2004, 2005. The novel, of course, immediately went on the back burner. And I was doing the other part of my writing life is I do paid work, editing or ghostwriting business books. So I found I could continue with that work through treatment and afterwards. because it was more logical and analytical, and it actually was very, somebody used the phrase meaningful work. That just goes to my heart. Meaningful work is such a blessing and very important to me, and I could still do meaningful work. And periodically in that year, and then even in the following year, I would look at the novel, and now it not only felt like bad writing, it felt like bad writing that someone else had done. There was no connection. And I have a very wise friend who has a deeply spiritual, and she just kept saying, it's not time yet. It's not time. And to me, not time means you don't do it this week. And I was very impatient. And so I would look at it now and then, and she got kind of angry with me, said, it's not time. So I waited, and it was a full 2 years before I went back to this novel. And by the time I went back, I'd gone through a process of surrender. And I had really said to God, I don't know if you want me to be writing. I don't know if you want me to be writing this book. I give up. And I wasn't mad. Sometimes when I say that, I'm mad, but this time I wasn't. I gave it up. And so when I did go back, finally, 2 years after being diagnosed, it was a very different book. I jumped in at the end of the novel with the novel's last few pages, and I knew immediately that things had changed dramatically. So what I learned is I don't want to do it if God's not part of it. And the first novel, I feel very good about my first novel, and I think God was part of it. Bidden or unbidden, God is present. Well, that was true with that novel. I don't think I'd really asked him to come along, but he was there, and I felt very guided in that book. But there are some of my short stories that, they're fine, but I wouldn't write them now because my priorities are different. And it doesn't mean that it has to be about faith explicitly, but it's just, I want to be in partnership with God. I want it to be the two of us, and whether that, as I said, whether that feels very explicit or just very quiet, way down deep within me, that's okay. So that's kind of how I go about it now. It's also become less, writing's hard. It is for me, not always, other people. What I like to say is Ron has finished another novel in the time it takes me to do a load of laundry, which I admit, it's a little exaggeration, but he keeps cranking them out. It's hard. I don't want to do it if it's not important work. That's changed dramatically for me. I don't want to write about, that's a great story. It has to really matter to me and both cost me something and give me something.
I think of Flannery O'Connor's suggestion for a Christian writer to be hotly in pursuit of the real, which I thought it's such a great phrase. I'm probably going to use it as a title for my next collection of essays. But and by that real, I don't think she means it's necessarily realistic fiction. I think what she's saying is that you're true to the spirit of humankind, true to the spirit of God. And I was thinking about how Jesus at one point talks about the unpardonable sin, the sin against the Holy Spirit. And basically that's what Hitler was doing, saying good was bad, bad was good. Truth was a lie for him. I think consequently, the writer has to, in creating a world, has to be true to what he or she knows about human beings and how they act, their psychology, their goals, their fears, and all that stuff, but also how God's goodness and grace is available. I think that's what she meant by hotly in pursuit of the real. God was very real to Flannery and to a lot of Christian writers, but also God has blessed the earth and blessed human beings, and you have to see the good in other people. And if you're not reporting that, you're somehow telling a lie. So.
In just a minute, we're going to open it up for questions from the crowd here assembled, but maybe one more. And so maybe it's not even so much a question as an invitation to reflect with us on some themes. So I've heard even today grace and forgiveness, adversity. It's got to cost you something. And I'm wondering, are there truths that our culture has forgotten that of which it needs to be reminded that you try to express in your work?
I think my greatest fear about work is writing trivial work. And that's the kind of fear about my earlier short stories. They're fine. They were workshopped by some of this country's best writers. They're good, solid stories. But I want to be writing about what matters. I want to go deep. I want to be writing about what matters most to me. And so I'm really careful about what I read. A kind of just a great read. I'm careful about that. And, there are times when it's good to just escape and have something be kind of, well, I don't know. I don't know if I don't want to read it. I don't want it to be mindless. That's what television is for, right? So I want it, well, no, seriously, that's when I check out, is when I'm watching TV. It's a different kind of a thing. But when I'm reading, I'm still working. I'm paying attention. You can pick up bad habits from reading bad writing the same way you can do it with a bad tennis player, right? It comes over across. And so I'm very careful about what I read. I don't want to read trivial work, and I don't want to write trivial work. I want to go deep and be writing about the things that are most important to me, which doesn't mean that every book has to be deadly serious. It's different. It has to matter. And I want to say that I read four student stories for today that I'll be talking about with these 4 Biola students, and I really admired the fact that they were all about serious things. A lot of times with teaching undergrads, they write about whatever happened in the dorm last weekend, which is different kinds of entertaining. You thank God your kids are... Your students did not do that. These four stories are about really important moments in characters' lives, and I admired that, and I was really, I was proud of them for you. So that's kind of where I think about these things.
For me, I have lots of ideas for stories or novels, and I stew about them for a while. But you have to develop an urgency. That's another way of saying what Bo was talking about. An urgency to tell this particular story, to exclude all the others. And I started, I think, 3 or 4 novels the last year. But that urgency wasn't there yet. And it could be what Bo's friend said was, it isn't time. And so you kind of just probe and wait. And there's a lot of waiting. Even in the midst of writing, there's a lot of waiting, waiting for the next sentence, waiting for the next image. One of the things I noticed about writing is that when it comes hardest for me, it's my subconscious telling me, don't write that scene, And when it comes easy for me, it's an example, I think, of grace, that the words flow. And I think, when Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, I think a lot of times a signal for us is that if it's easy, it's from God, and if it's a burden, it isn't. So I think that's true of writing too.
Okay, thank you. We have about, I think, maybe 15 minutes for some questions. So Brian will have a microphone. If someone has one, raise your hand.
We've stunned them into silence.
Yeah.
They're thinking, how dare you?
You get a promotion point for every question. No, just kidding about that.
Hi, especially for Ron. I remember having a conversation with an English professor about your work 15 years ago. I was recommending some of your work and describing it to her, and she said, "Oh, he's a genre novelist, right?" And my first reaction then was, "No, he's a novelist."
Right.
But then I remember when you wrote, I think it was "Isn't It Romantic?"
Mm-hmm.
I thought, well, there he actually seems like he's playing with genre on purpose.
Right.
And I'm wondering how your choice of genre helps you sort of develop a story, or how you play with genre.
Yeah, I think genre for me is not a bad thing. Genre is developed because they're comfortable to the readers. There's a particular genre in the Old Testament of a guy going to a well and meeting a woman, and then it's used again with a Samaritan woman. So for some reason, that story resonates with people, and then you use it for your own purposes. And I think that that's true of the genres I've picked. I've always wanted to write a mystery story as if everything about it actually happened. And so I didn't want to have anything fanciful. I didn't want to have Agatha Christie come and have all the suspects in the room. That's with Atticus. I felt I knew something about the Old West, having grown up in Nebraska. And so I thought of that as a historical novel, not a Western, Desperados and Jesse James. I thought Jesse James in particular was about good and evil, right and wrong, reckless ambition, that sort of thing. Crime does not pay. But it's nice to have the armature or the architecture to build all those things on, and to try and sneak in your philosophy or theology while making people think they're just turning the pages.
So I'm aware that you're both teachers of writing as well as writers. And that seems like a particularly hard thing to do.
Yeah.
You may not even call it teaching. That's kind of my question is how have you come to understand what you do with other writers? What is this education? Is it midwifery? Is it mentorship? Is it feedback? And I don't think that your answers will be just valuable for those who teach writing. I think probably some of us in this room feel like a lot of things we teach is hard to transfer.
Right.
It's a sensibility, it's a sensitivity. But talk a little bit, if you would, about what you've learned about what you do as people who teach writing, and how that's informed what education is,
Right.
in some broader sense, even though you probably wouldn't want to make that claim.
I have a short answer because it is hard. It's so hard I stopped doing it. I taught for 3 years at Stanford from 92 to 95 and taught fiction writing to undergrads and also to continuing studies, the adult program. And I overdid it. I'm not good at pacing myself. And so I think one year I taught 8 classes. It was just 2, 2, 2, 2. And I wore myself out. And I was better at it. I mean, I felt like I did a good job, and I had good evaluations for whatever that's worth. But it was harder at the end than at the beginning. And I had, I didn't know it at the time, but I'm actually really am an introvert. And so it was taking more and more energy to get up in front of this group of people 2 times a week or whatever it was. But so coming back, this is the first time, just between us, this is the first time I've taught in a while, and I was worried about it and kind of worried about my skills and all that. I haven't looked at a student story for a long time, and it was hard. Teaching is hard, but I really I have enjoyed it, and the part I enjoy, what it's about to me in any subject, is about helping that student to do their best work. And to get at what is in a short story, that's pretty concrete in some ways. A teacher can say, this is good, this is not as good, or this story is trivial, or this story, here's the meat of it. You don't need any of this other stuff. Here's the meat of it. And, with luck and, the student can understand that and see. I remember as a student getting really excited at the possibilities, even though only this one paragraph was going to stay. That's what revision is about. And I think that's very exciting to help people, see the good in what they've done that they can't see. We don't often, a lot of times we don't see the good in ourselves. And it seems to me it's the same thing with teaching. We can say, this is good, and then you learn how to do that for yourself more and more. Now for the pro.
Yeah, I kind of divide it, and I teach a course, an introduction to film study. So I'm teaching them about genre, I'm teaching them about major directors, the history of film, cinematography, sound design, all those things. And that is teaching to me. But when they turn in the papers, I'm a coach. And the same thing is true, I teach a screenwriting class and fiction writing classes on occasion. And then I'm coaching, not teaching. It's just, you see a product and you're saying, don't do that anymore. Or just stress this a little more, or here's where it really gets hot. That kind of thing. So it's much more hands-on in a writing class than it is in a literature or film class. So that's the distinction I would make. Well, one of the difficult things is coaches yell at their players, and the players get angry with them and all that, and they get evaluated by their wins and losses. I can't yell at my students, and I can't conform them to what the kind of writer I want them to be, because I have to worry about evaluations. And it's good when they don't hate you. But it's a really interesting process, and it wears you out, like Bo said. But One of the things I have to be careful of is that you're really using the same muscle you do for your own fiction. So you have to be wary about being so invested in your students' work that you don't produce any of your own. And I see that among a lot of my faculty colleagues.
Ron, could you comment on the elation or the disappointment, devastation on the other side of seeing a novel go through the birth canal of that whole process and then coming out,
Yeah.
what with a deformed head at the end in terms of the film? And were you happy with the results? And
Well, I've actually I had one TV show, Private Eye, that was made in 1987, and it was my first experience of destruction. I was reading the TV Guide summary, and I thought, well, this can't be my show. It had the same title, but it didn't sound the same, and it turned out they had extra footage from some other show that they'd done, and I kind of fitted it in. It was and I had this big party scene, and I wasn't on the set to see what was happening, but this guy, Cleary, goes up to this big party, he knocks on the door, and some butler opens it and says, "No party, too expensive," and he shuts the door. And it was like the director talking to me and saying, "We don't have money for you to do this big scene." But that was my first experience. And then I wrote the screenplay for Mariette in Ecstasy, and it was shot up in Toronto. And with good people, Geraldine O'Rourke played Mariette, and John Mahoney played her father. Mary McDonald was Mariette's sister. Eva Marie Saint was another nun. And it was pretty good. And then when they showed it to an audience, for one thing, the audience was expecting a completely different film when they saw it was called Mariette in Ecstasy. And they were somewhat disappointed. And it went back and forth. In the novel, it goes back and forth in time because it's a kind of an inquiry into what actually happened to Mariette. And then they decided after the first test where it didn't go well that they were going to put it in chronological order. Then they discovered these huge gaps in the narrative. And so they tried to fill it in with voiceover narrative. And I wrote the voiceover narrative, and then a woman who worked at Saturday Night Live also wrote voiceover narrative. And one of the most excruciating days of my life was sitting at this table with the executive producer, and he'd have me read mine, and then he listened to hers, and he says, "You know, I think she understands your novel better than you do." And she won every case. And so that was awful. And then Atticus was turned into a TV movie with James Coburn, and it was called Missing Pieces. And it actually had a lot of viewers. It was one of those Hallmark things where you got 15 minutes of film, then 15 minutes of commercial, and so it goes on for a long time. But they didn't use a single line of dialogue from the novel, and actually changed a lot of the aspects of the novel. And one of the screenwriters and I were on the set with James Coburn, and he was doing some of his lines. I turned over to him, I said, "Richard, did you write that?" He said, "No, you write that." And I said, "No, it's not." And Coburn overheard us, and he just blew the line over and over again. And finally, some guy whisked away and says, "It's time to take you for lunch." And then by the time I was done with lunch, all the filming was over. So that was my one excruciating moment. But I still liked it. I liked hearing somebody say lines relatively close to mine. And it was all shot in Santa Barbara. And when you're going there, it says, "Atticus this way, Atticus this way." And then I got a little chair that says Atticus and Ron Hansen on it. So I liked all that stuff, and I liked the money. And then they had a big premiere party with a mariachi band and all that. That was kind of fun. But that's one of those things you're not proud of, and I'm not proud of the finished version of Mariette in Ecstasy, and luckily the company went bankrupt, so they never released it. So it's safe in a Utah vault somewhere. But with Jesse James, it was totally faithful to the novel, and I was just talking to Casey Affleck about this, and I said, I just love hearing people say my lines, because I only hear them in one way, and the actors give so much different coloration. They'll try mournful, they'll try happy and all that, and it's interesting to hear the variations. Casey said, "Ron, you're way too generous." And, it really is an experience. Whenever I'm on a film set, no matter how badly they're doing it, I'm grinning in some way. So I just like the whole process of it. And you get good films and bad films, but all of them are interesting. Yeah.
So one more question,
So this is a question for you, Ms. Caldwell. One of the scenes that I liked in City of Tranquil Light was the whole narrative about the bandit and his conversion. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you take historical research and turn it into a story. Because part of that, I'm sure, was based on the memoirs that you were reading, but you must have transformed it into, as a novelist, creating a story arc.
The bandit is mine. I totally claim the bandit. He's not based on anybody I knew. Or when I was doing the research, bandits at that time in China, 1920s, say, in the interior, bandits were a very real and constant danger. And so as I was doing the research and I learned that, you know, as a novelist, you get to be God. And so I read about bandits and said, yes, one bandit, please. I knew I wanted a bandit. And so I wrote the scene with the bandit. I knew that he would kidnap Will and that he would keep my character for a while. And it was fun doing that. I could see what they were. The bandits would steal things they wouldn't know what to do with. So they'd have a cummerbund, as a scarf or whatever. They wouldn't know what to do with these things, so they were wearing them. And the detail that everybody likes that I can't claim, I read it, is the bandit was gambling and he had a very large woman's brassiere tied around him and he was using the cups for his coins. So I totally stole that, I admit it. The bandit started out that way. But at its best, and this is one of the rewards of writing for me, because it is, as I said, it's hard. But one of the rewards is sometimes when the piece of writing does take on a life of its own, and it no longer feels like I'm making it up. It feels like I'm discovering, and I'm just saying. And the bandit became like that for me. I was writing while he had captured Will and the gambling scene and all that. But I didn't think I'd ever see him again in the novel. And he did. He went through as dramatic a change as anybody in the novel. And he kept popping up. And he was integral to the plot. And I just kind of, I think for me it's really important to be open, to keep being open as I'm working. And to, if he wants to show up, hey, come on in. And to keep watching for places where I can kind of open the windows in the novel and see if there's something else. Maybe there's something else outside the window better than what I was thinking. So I didn't have any, I'd love to say that I had planned his every move. I didn't. There's a place where he's wearing a strand of pearls. He's a beggar, and he's wearing a strand of pearls that are important plot-wise. The characters recognize him because of these pearls. And I was at a church one day, and there was a guy who worked at that church who was, I think, pretty much homeless, and the church let him do odd jobs around there. His name's Larry, and every day he would have on some weird getup, and he was wearing the pearls one day. And so, in they went. I had that moment of, oh, that's my bandit. In they go. So he was a gift. He was a gift to me, and I enjoyed his company.
Well, thank you. Let's thank our guests.